Before history was recorded in stone, it was marked in flesh and fire by those who fell from the sky. Beings of light who chose darkness, whose sins would shape the fate of the world. This is the story of their transgression, of the colossal monsters they created, and of the earth they turned to ruin. There was an age shrouded in mystery, a time before even the days of Noah, a forgotten age whose shadows still whisper over creation. In that lost past, a darkness fell upon the world, silent and inexorable, creeping across the land like a plague that consumed everything in its path. In the heavens, the sons of God, the angelic watchers, guardians of humanity, raised their curious eyes. These celestial beings had been appointed since the dawn of creation to observe, to protect, to guide humanity along the path ordained by the Almighty. They were beings of pure light, consciousness without corruption, servants of the Most High who knew nothing but obedience and duty. Their existence had been one of perfect harmony with the divine will, their purpose clear and unwavering. They watched from the celestial realm as humanity took its first steps, as civilizations began to form, as men and women built their lives under the watchful gaze of these divine sentinels. And it was then that they saw the daughters of men. Their beauty was intoxicating, almost forbidden, a radiance that seemed to call out across the vast divide between heaven and earth. The mortal women moved through their lives with a grace that captivated these celestial observers, their laughter like music that reached even to the highest heavens, their forms possessing a vitality and warmth that the angels had never known in their existence of pure spirit. A single thought, simple and corrosive, took root in their hearts. It began as mere curiosity, an innocent wondering about what it might be like to experience the physical world as mortals did, to feel the warmth of the sun on skin, to taste the fruits of the earth, to know the touch of another being. Curiosity became desire, desire became obsession, and obsession became rebellion. What started as a whisper in the minds of a few spread like wildfire among the watchers. They began to question their purpose, to wonder why they should remain distant and untouchable when such beauty existed in the world below. The boundaries that had always seemed natural and right began to feel like chains, restrictions imposed upon them without reason or justice. They spoke among themselves in hushed tones, sharing their forbidden thoughts, feeding each other's growing discontent with their celestial lot. And with that act, the heavens shattered. The harmony that had existed since the beginning of time was broken by a single act of defiance, a choice that would echo through the ages and reshape the very fabric of creation. Eternity became unstable, the foundations of the cosmic order trembling as angels contemplated the unthinkable. And the world knew a chaos no man would ever forget. Giants walked the earth, their footsteps shaking the ground, their shadows falling across entire villages. Cities were built of iron and blood, monuments to power and corruption that reached toward the heavens in mockery of their former home. And the echo of that sin resounded through the generations, a curse that would haunt humanity for ages to come. Everything we know today was born from the shadows of those who dared to defy heaven. The world we inhabit, with all its pain and struggle, its violence and corruption, bears the scars of that ancient rebellion. The knowledge of good and evil that plagues human consciousness, the capacity for cruelty that lurks in every heart, the darkness that can overwhelm even the brightest soul, all of it traces back to that moment when the Watchers chose to abandon their posts and descend to earth. Under a heavy sky laden with an unspoken fate, Samjaza, the leader of the fallen angels, gathered 200 of his brothers atop the snow-capped peaks of Mount Hermon. The mountain rose like a spear thrust into the heavens, its summit perpetually crowned with snow and ice, isolated from the world below by sheer cliffs and treacherous passes. It was a place between earth and sky, neither fully of one realm nor the other, fitting for the terrible oath that was about to be sworn. The frigid air bit their faces, though they felt it not with physical sensation but with a spiritual awareness of the barrier they were about to cross. The cold was a harbinger of the isolation that would follow their choice, a taste of the separation from divine warmth that would become their eternal lot. The gravity of the moment made nothing else matter. Time seemed to stand still, the very fabric of creation holding its breath as these celestial beings prepared to make a choice from which there would be no return. The stars themselves seemed to dim, as if unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. The wind ceased its howling, leaving only the sound of angelic breath and the beating of hearts that had never before known fear or doubt. Samjaza, his voice firm but carrying an undertone of uncertainty, began to speak. "I fear I will be the only one to pay the price for this great sin," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones cast into a deep well. His eyes swept across the faces of his gathered brothers, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that they might turn back from this precipice. He knew the magnitude of what they were contemplating, understood that the consequences would be severe and eternal. The weight of leadership pressed upon him, the knowledge that he would bear the greatest responsibility for leading so many astray. A heavy silence followed, each angel wrestling with his own thoughts, his own doubts and desires. The moment stretched on, filled with the tension of decision, the awareness that the next words spoken would seal their fate forever. Then, broken by the words of another angel, the silence shattered. "No, Samjaza, we will all swear," the angel declared, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to spread through the assembled host like fire through dry grass. "We will all commit to this path. What has been done cannot be undone. We have already crossed the threshold in our hearts. Now we must complete the journey with our actions." Other voices joined in, a chorus of affirmation that grew in volume and intensity. Each angel adding his voice to the collective oath, binding himself to the others and to the terrible decision they were making together. They spoke of the beauty they had witnessed, of the desire that consumed them, of their belief that they had the right to experience all that creation had to offer. They convinced themselves that their choice was justified, that the rules that bound them were arbitrary and unjust, that they were merely claiming what should have been theirs from the beginning. With a resolute look, Samjaza concluded, his voice now steady and sure, all doubt apparently vanquished by the collective determination of his brothers. "Then so be it. The fate of us all is sealed. The fall is inevitable. We choose this path with open eyes, accepting whatever consequences may come. Let it be recorded in the annals of eternity that we were not driven to this by ignorance or deception, but chose it freely, believing ourselves justified in our rebellion." With that they swore. A vow that would transform their souls and damn them forever, words spoken with the full power of angelic will, binding them to each other and to their chosen course with chains stronger than any physical bond. The pact was sealed with the strength of a promise no one could break, witnessed by the mountain itself, by the stars above and the earth below, by every element of creation that would soon feel the consequences of this terrible oath. And there was no turning back. They were committed not only to the fall, but to the consequences that would come with it. Consequences they could scarcely imagine, horrors that would unfold across the generations, suffering that would touch every corner of the earth. And so they descended, not with the gentleness of angelic wings gliding peacefully through the celestial realms, but with the brutal force of an inevitable fall, like meteors tearing through the atmosphere, leaving trails of fire in their wake. They fell like blazing stars, their celestial forms struggling to contain the power that now burned out of control within them, tearing through the sky and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The very air ignited as they passed, creating ribbons of flame that stretched across the horizon, visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. The sound of their descent was like thunder that would not end, a continuous roar that shook the earth and sent animals fleeing in terror. As their feet touched the ground, the earth itself seemed to tremble under the impact, cracks spreading outward from the points where they landed like spiderwebs across the surface of the world. Mountains shuddered, valleys echoed with the sound of their arrival, and the seas rose in great waves that crashed against distant shores. For their forms burned with a terrible, unholy light, a radiance that was nothing like the pure illumination they had once possessed in their celestial state. This light was corrupt, tainted, carrying within it the mark of rebellion and the poison of defiance. It hurt to look upon them directly, for the light contained darkness, beauty twisted into something grotesque and terrifying. The silent universe seemed for a moment to stand still, as if all creation recognized that something fundamental had changed, that a line had been crossed from which there would be no return. The laws of nature themselves seemed to hold their breath, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented violation of the cosmic order. Mortals, upon seeing those brilliant, colossal figures emerging from the flames and smoke of their landing, stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Some fell to their knees in worship, mistaking these fallen beings for gods descended from heaven to walk among humanity. Others fled in terror, recognizing instinctively that these were not messengers of peace but harbingers of chaos and destruction. And then with a voice charged with dark power, resonating with tones that no human throat could produce, Samjaza spoke, looking at his brethren and the mortals around him who had gathered to witness their arrival. "What has been done cannot be undone," he proclaimed, his words carrying across the land with supernatural clarity, reaching ears miles away as if he stood beside each listener. "We are the fallen, and the world will be different from now on. The old order has passed away and a new age begins, an age of power, of knowledge, of freedom from the constraints that have bound both angels and men. We bring you gifts beyond imagining, secrets of heaven itself, the wisdom that has been hidden from you since the beginning of time. With the power of their fiery essence, the fallen angels took human wives, selecting the most beautiful women from among the daughters of men, claiming them as their own without regard for existing bonds or commitments. They appeared to these women as gods, irresistible in their beauty and power, speaking words of love and desire that no mortal man could match. The women, overwhelmed by the attention of these supernatural beings, yielded to their advances, not understanding the terrible consequences that would follow from these unions. And with them they begot children, coupling in ways that violated every natural law, mixing the celestial and the terrestrial in combinations that should never have existed. But these were no ordinary children. They were no mere mortals, no simple continuation of the human lineage that had existed since Adam. These children were born with an ancient hunger in their eyes and a power that broke the laws of nature, emerging from the womb already possessing strength and awareness far beyond any human infant. Their first cries were like roars that shook the walls of the houses where they were born. Their tiny hands could grasp with the strength of grown men. Their eyes gleamed with an intelligence and malevolence that chilled the hearts of those who looked into them. They grew to immense stature at a rate that defied all natural development, their bodies reaching heights that blocked out the sun within a few short years of their birth. By the time they reached adolescence, they towered over normal humans like adults over children, their bodies continuing to grow until they reached truly gigantic proportions. Some stood 12 feet tall, others 15, and the largest among them reached heights of 20 feet or more, their heads level with the roofs of the tallest buildings. They were the Nephilim, the giants, descendants of a pact that sealed their fate and the fate of the world, beings that should never have existed, abominations born from the unholy union of the celestial and the mortal. The weight of their fall lay before them, a burden that would press down upon the earth for generations to come. The world would never be the same again, forever scarred by the presence of these creatures and the corruption they would spread. Their presence was a living, palpable terror that spread like a shadow over every human tribe, a darkness that could be felt even by those who had not yet seen the giants with their own eyes. Children of fallen angels and mortal women, these creatures possessed strength and cunning beyond human limits, combining the power and knowledge of their celestial fathers with the physical substance and appetites of their mortal mothers. They became kings and tyrants, seizing power over human communities through a combination of physical domination and the supernatural authority they inherited from their fathers. They established kingdoms where they ruled as gods, demanding worship and tribute from the humans who cowered beneath their shadow. They became gods and monsters in the legends of every culture, their deeds remembered and embellished until it became impossible to separate truth from myth. They became legendary heroes to some, to those who benefited from their favor or who chose to serve them in hopes of sharing in their power. But they were nightmares to all, for even those who worshipped them knew fear, understood that they served beings whose mercy was as capricious as the wind, whose anger could bring instant and terrible death. At first, their hunger was natural, or at least seemed so to observers. Animals and fruits of the earth were devoured mercilessly, the giants consuming quantities of food that would feed a village for weeks in a single meal. Herds of cattle disappeared down their throats, entire orchards were stripped bare in hours, fishing communities found their nets empty as the giants waded into the seas and devoured everything they could catch. But their appetite grew, becoming insatiable with each passing year, expanding beyond mere physical hunger into something darker and more terrible. The food of the earth, no matter how abundant, could not satisfy the void within them, the emptiness born from their unnatural creation. Soon, nothing nature offered was enough to fill the bottomless pit of their hunger. The giants looked around at the world with eyes that saw everything as potential sustenance, everything as something to be consumed and dominated. Their eyes turned to humanity itself, viewing the very beings from whom they had descended as nothing more than another source of food. The hunt began, and with it, the world writhed in agony, humanity learning what it meant to be prey, to live in constant fear of being devoured by the very beings who had once walked among them as kin. The earth itself, corrupted by the presence of these abominations and the forbidden knowledge shared by their fallen angel fathers, began to spawn horrors of its own. The natural order broke down, the carefully maintained boundaries between species dissolved, and creation itself seemed to go mad. Deformed creatures emerged from the shadows, abominations that should never have existed, beings that seemed cobbled together from nightmares and madness. Impossible hybrids born from the encounter of species separated by divine design began to appear. Creatures with the body of a lion and the wings of an eagle, serpents with human faces, beasts that combined the features of multiple animals in ways that violated every principle of natural law. Every cry of pain, Every human tear seemed to fertilize the soil with the corruption that spread like a plague, seeping into the very foundations of the world. The blood spilled by the giants and the suffering of their victims somehow fed the growing darkness, causing it to expand and intensify with each passing day. The land itself became sick, trees bore strange fruits that poisoned those who ate them, rivers ran foul with substances that had never existed before, and the sky took on colors that no human eye had seen prior to the fall of the Watchers. And the Watchers, their celestial parents, witnesses and architects of this chaos, did not simply stand by and watch. They actively participated in the corruption, sharing with humanity forbidden secrets meant to remain locked in the heavens, knowledge that had been kept from mortals for good reason. They believed, in their pride and delusion, that they were elevating humanity, sharing divine wisdom that would transform the mortal condition. But every secret they revealed only deepened the corruption, adding new dimensions to the suffering and chaos that was consuming the world. Azazel, prince among the fallen, the most beautiful and most proud of all the Watchers who had rebelled, taught men to forge weapons with a skill and sophistication far beyond anything humans had developed on their own. Under his instruction, they learned to craft cutting swords that could cleave through armor and bone with equal ease, impenetrable shields that could withstand blows that would shatter stone, instruments of war that would shape kingdoms of blood for generations to come. He taught them the secrets of metallurgy, showing them how to extract ores from the earth and refine them into metals of terrible purity and strength. He instructed them in the arts of war, showing them formations and strategies that turned human armies into efficient killing machines. Others brought dark astrology, teaching humans to read the movements of the stars and planets, to divine the future and to believe that fate was written in the heavens and could not be changed. They taught magic that could bend the elements to human will, spells that distorted the soul and bent the will of others, enchantments that promised power but delivered only corruption and madness. They shared the secrets of herbalism, but not for healing. They taught the preparation of poisons that could kill silently and leave no trace, drugs that could enslave the mind and body, potions that promised pleasure but delivered addiction and despair. Humanity, intoxicated by this knowledge, drunk on the power it seemed to offer, sank into profound corruption. The gift of knowledge, which should have been a blessing, became a curse in the hands of beings unprepared for its weight. Violence ceased to be punishment, ceased to be a last resort or a tragic necessity. It became celebration, something to be gloried in and pursued for its own sake. Men killed not from need or even from anger, but from the sheer joy of killing, from the pleasure they found in dominating and destroying others. Chaos was now law, the only rule that mattered was the rule of the strong over the weak, and strength was measured purely in terms of the ability to inflict pain and death. Even nature groaned under the weight of the corruption that had been unleashed upon the world. Darkened skies hid the sun for days at a time, the heavens themselves seeming to turn away from the horror unfolding below. And the ailing earth showed signs of a disease as old as the mountains, as deep as the roots of the world itself. A rot that stretched from the heart of life to its deepest roots, touching everything, corrupting everything, leaving nothing pure or untouched. Plants grew twisted and strange, animals became fierce and aggressive even when unprovoked, and the land itself seemed to cry out in pain. It was the birth of an age of shadow, a time when darkness covered the earth both literally and spiritually, where the divine and the mortal collided in ways that produced only destruction and suffering. And the world, for a brief moment in the long span of eternity, knew a horror that would never be forgotten, a darkness so complete that it seemed impossible that light could ever return. In the abyss of decay, when humanity's hopes seemed to have been extinguished like a candle in the wind, when it appeared that evil had triumphed completely and irreversibly, a divine sign appeared. A voice, powerful and unmistakable, rising from the chaos with the weight of an ancient promise, cutting through the darkness like a sword of light. God, in his infinite wisdom and justice, watching the suffering of the remnant of humanity that still remained faithful, decided that the time had come to act. He sent a man, not an army of angels, not a supernatural intervention that would overwhelm with divine power, but a simple man who would stand as a witness against the corruption. Not just any man, but someone chosen, someone who walked side by side with the Creator without fear, without hesitation, maintaining his faith and purity even in a world gone mad. His name was Enoch, a name that would echo through the ages, becoming synonymous with righteousness and prophetic vision. In a land ravaged by the corruption and tyranny of the Nephilim, where the darkness of oppression was absolute and seemed eternal, where hope had been crushed under the feet of giants and ground into the dust, Enoch's voice resounded with the force of thunder in the silent desert. He feared neither the giants who dominated the world, whose very footsteps caused earthquakes, nor the fallen angels who with their wisdom and power had corrupted creation itself. He knew that the Almighty guided him, that he walked under divine protection, and that no power on earth or in the corrupted heavens could stand against the will of the Most High. And with that confidence, with that unshakable faith, he cast his message to the winds, speaking words that carried supernatural clarity and reached even to the most distant corners of the earth. O children of heaven, you who abandoned the glorious home you came from, you who defiled the earth with your presence and your teachings, know this, Enoch proclaimed, his voice carrying an authority that silenced even the mockery of the giants. The Most High sees all, nothing is hidden from his eyes, no sin goes unnoticed, no act of rebellion will be forgotten. And he will come to judge, he will descend in wrath and righteousness to cleanse the earth of the corruption you have spread, to sweep away everything that stands in opposition to his perfect will. Enoch's words were like a prophecy written in fire, burning themselves into the consciousness of all who heard them, echoing through the mountains and across the desert, carried on the wind to every ear. The fallen angels heard them and trembled, for they recognized in Enoch's voice the echo of the divine presence they had left behind, the authority of heaven itself speaking through mortal lips. The giants heard them and raged, for they understood that Enoch spoke of their destruction, the end of their dominion over the earth. But only a handful of souls heeded his warning, only a few among humanity chose to turn away from the corruption and seek righteousness while there was still time. The world mocked, the vast majority refusing to believe that judgment would come, convincing themselves that the current state of affairs would continue indefinitely. The masses laughed at the old prophet, calling him mad, dismissing him as a relic of a past age who could not accept the new order of things. They were blind to the impending storm that loomed like an endless shadow on the horizon, unable or unwilling to see the signs of coming judgment that Enoch pointed out to them day after day. God's judgment, however, had already begun, even as the world continued its descent into madness. The wheels of divine justice had been set in motion, and nothing could stop them now. The giants continued their tyranny, erecting their impossible towers that seemed to challenge heaven itself, building monuments to their own glory that reached toward the sky in mockery of the Creator. Their laws, written in blood and enforced with brutal violence, were imposed upon humanity without mercy or compassion. And humanity, lost and directionless, having abandoned all moral compass, furiously imitated the cruelty they saw, each person seeking to become as much like the giants as possible, glorying in violence and domination. Enoch, his heart heavy with the pain of a world in ruins, with grief for the suffering of the innocent and righteous anger at the corruption of the guilty, walked among the ashes of the cities the Nephilim had destroyed. He saw the broken bodies of those who had resisted the giants' rule, the burned homes of families who had been deemed unworthy to live, the mass graves where entire communities had been buried after failing to provide sufficient tribute to their monstrous overlords. He spoke of what he saw, bearing witness to the horror, but also of visions that burned in his mind like eternal flames. These were visions of a future where everything would be consumed, where the corruption would be purged with fire and water, where destruction would be total and irreversible. "I have seen the end," Enoch proclaimed, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "The mountains will melt like wax before the fury of the Lord. The stars will fall from the sky as the heavens themselves are shaken. And the armies of the Lord will descend in fire and vengeance, bringing judgment upon all who have chosen rebellion over righteousness, corruption over purity, death over life." As these words reached the ears of the fallen angels, carried to them on the winds of prophecy, until then invulnerable in their power and pride, an emotion they had never experienced overwhelmed them. Fear, cold and terrible, gripped their hearts for the first time since they had begun their rebellion. For the first time since their fall, they trembled, understanding that their time was limited, that their power was not absolute, that there was indeed a force in the universe greater than their own will and might. They who had fallen through pride, who had rebelled because they believed themselves equal to or even greater than the authority of heaven, now approached Enoch with humility they had never shown before. Their once radiant forms now seemed somber, dimmed by the weight of their guilt and gripped by the dread of what was to come. They prostrated themselves before the prophet, beings of immense power bowing before a mortal man because he carried the authority of the divine. "Prophet, intercede for us," they begged, their voices stripped of the arrogance that had characterized their speech since their fall. "Take our petition to the Creator. We acknowledge our error, we recognize our sin, we understand now the magnitude of what we have done. We beseech His mercy, we ask for forgiveness, we hope that it is not too late to turn back from the path we have chosen." Enoch, burdened with the responsibility of a divine messenger, weighted down by the terrible knowledge of what he must relay to these fallen beings, brought their petitions to the throne of God. He ascended in spirit to the heavenly realms, leaving his body behind as his consciousness rose through the spheres of existence until he stood before the very presence of the Almighty. There, in that place beyond time and space, where the glory of God burned with an intensity that would destroy any unprepared soul, Enoch presented the plea of the fallen angels. But the time for mercy had run out, the period of grace had ended, the opportunity for repentance had passed. Judgment was sealed, irrevocable and final, and the scales of justice were about to tip irreversibly against the fallen angels. They had made their choice and now they would face the consequences. The sin was too great, the corruption too deep, the damage too extensive for mercy to be granted. The world had to be cleansed, creation had to be purified, and that could only happen through judgment. When Enoch returned from his vision, descending once more into his physical form and appearing before the fallen angels who waited anxiously for his response, his face was a mask of sadness. The sorrow evident in his features was evidence that the fate of those who had rebelled was irrevocably sealed, that there would be no reprieve, no second chance, no escape from the consequences of their choices. He looked at the fallen angels, these beings who had once stood in the presence of God and now stood condemned before him, now in a state of profound despair, their hope crushed by the finality of divine judgment. His voice, heavy with the weight of the message he carried, delivered words that fell like hammer blows upon their consciousness. "There will be no peace for you," Enoch pronounced, each word deliberate and clear, allowing no room for misunderstanding or false hope. "No forgiveness, no return to what you once were. Your children, the giants you have fathered, will be destroyed before your eyes, and you will be forced to witness the downfall of all that you have created, powerless to prevent it or to save them." These words, like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, split the silence that surrounded them, shattering whatever remained of their pride and hope. The power of what had been said seemed to reverberate throughout the land, spreading outward in waves that touched every corner of creation. The fallen angels fell to their knees, overwhelmed by despair, finally understanding the full magnitude of what they had done and what it would cost them. As the heavens prepared to carry out the sentence that had long been announced, as the forces of judgment assembled and the mechanism of purification was set in motion, the world continued its descent into darkness, unaware that deliverance was coming, though it would come in the form of terrible destruction. In the vast land where the giants ruled, their colossal figures marched like unbeatable gods across the landscape, their footsteps leaving impressions in the earth deep enough to form ponds when the rains came. They were arrogant in their power, convinced of their invincibility, and blind in their confidence, unable to conceive of any force that might challenge their dominion. They believed themselves untouchable, beyond the reach of any retribution, indifferent to the whisper of approaching death that Enoch had spoken. Their hearts were so numb with violence and destruction, so hardened by cruelty and excess, that fate seemed a distant, irrelevant concept, something that applied to lesser beings but not to them. But time, like a relentless current that carries all things before it, is unforgiving even to giants, and their end was closer than they imagined. The prophecies spoken by Enoch were not idle threats but declarations of imminent reality. On the horizon, visible to those with spiritual eyes, a dark omen began to take shape, the first signs of the judgment that would soon fall upon the earth like an unstoppable avalanche. As the world sank into the darkness of decay, as corruption reached its peak and it seemed that evil had achieved complete and total victory, a new figure emerged from the shadows, stepping forward into the light of history. A simple man, his soul scarred by the weight of hardship and the grief of living in a world gone mad, without fame or power in the conventional sense, without armies or wealth or political influence, but with something far more valuable than any of these things: purity of heart, unwavering faith, and absolute obedience to the divine will. His callous hands bore witness to the hard work and humble life he had chosen, the rough texture of his palms speaking of countless hours of labor, of a man who earned his bread through honest toil rather than through violence or exploitation. His name was Noah, a name that meant rest or comfort, and he would indeed provide rest from the corruption and comfort in the midst of judgment. He was no hero of grand appearance, no mighty warrior or charismatic leader, but his soul resonated like a beacon of light amidst the darkness, a flame of righteousness that refused to be extinguished no matter how strong the winds of evil blew around him. His eyes, still shining with hope when all others had succumbed to despair, reached for the heavens, even when the earth was consumed by evil and it seemed that God had abandoned his creation. Noah maintained his connection to the divine, refusing to be pulled down into the mire of corruption that surrounded him on every side. He lived differently from his neighbors, followed different laws, worshipped the true God when all around him were bowing to idols and giants. Noah walked alone in his righteousness, separated from the mainstream of his society by his refusal to participate in their corruption. But he was never truly alone, for while the giants sank in their wars and their cities crumbled to dust under the weight of their own corruption, Noah walked with God, maintaining a relationship with the divine that had become rare to the point of uniqueness in that dark age. He was the last flame of justice in a lost generation, a generation sinking into wickedness, corruption, and violence with such enthusiasm that it seemed they raced toward their own destruction. One night, when the wind seemed to carry the weight of the world's sorrow, when Noah lay awake troubled by the evil he saw all around him, something incredible happened that would change not just his life but the fate of all creation. A radiant light descended from the sky, not with the heat of destruction like the falling of the watchers, but with a fire that would not burn, a divine presence that brought warmth and comfort rather than terror. It was a manifestation of the divine presence itself, a force that filled Noah's soul with an intoxicating awe that left him breathless, but also with a supernatural calm that steadied his trembling limbs and strengthened his resolve. The air grew thick, charged with a power that could not be challenged, a holiness so intense that Noah felt simultaneously unworthy to be in its presence and completely accepted by it. And then came the voice, not speaking with physical sound but directly to his soul, words that carried absolute authority and could not be doubted or disobeyed. "Behold, the end of all flesh has come before me," the voice declared, each word resonating with the weight of divine judgment and the sorrow of necessary destruction. "The earth is filled with violence through them, corruption has spread to every corner of creation, and the pollution of sin has seeped into the very soil. And because of this, because wickedness has reached its full measure and the cries of the innocent have reached my ears, I will destroy it with the earth, I will sweep away the corruption with a purifying flood. But you, Noah, have found favor in my eyes. You have remained faithful when all others turned aside. Therefore build yourself an ark, a vessel of salvation that will preserve life through the coming judgment." Noah, filled with holy fear that was somehow distinct from terror, experiencing that unique combination of dread and trust that characterizes a proper encounter with the divine, didn't question what he had heard. There was no room for doubt in the face of such absolute authority. The vision was clear, the command unmistakable, and the urgency obvious. With steady hands, despite the magnitude of the task before him, and a resolute heart fortified by faith and divine encounter, he began construction immediately, starting the very next morning as the sun rose over a world that had no idea judgment was coming. The sound of the hammer striking the woodwork became a constant rhythm in his life, echoing across the land day after day, the only sound of hope in a world filled with the cries of victims and the laughter of oppressors. It was a solitary rhythm, for Noah worked largely alone except for his sons who helped him, but charged with profound meaning that went far beyond the simple act of building a boat. Each hammer stroke was a response to the chaos unfolding around him, an act of faith in the face of overwhelming corruption, a declaration that righteousness had not been completely extinguished from the earth. The people, seeing his work grow over the months and years, gathered to mock him, finding entertainment in what they perceived as the madness of a deluded old man. "Look at the old man," they would call out, their voices thick with contempt and amusement. "He builds a ship on dry land, miles from any ocean or sea. Has the sun fried his head? Has he gone mad in his old age? Where is this flood he speaks of? The rain falls and stops as it always has, the rivers flow in their courses as they always have, the world continues as it always has and always will." But Noah didn't answer their mockery, didn't waste his breath trying to convince those who had already closed their hearts to truth. His answer lay in the wood he cut with careful precision, in the ark that rose day by day from the ground, growing larger and more impressive with each passing season. He was unshaken by their ridicule, for he knew he was accomplishing something greater than himself, participating in a divine plan that transcended human understanding. The ark itself was a marvel of construction, built according to specifications that came directly from God. It was enormous, 300 cubits in length, 50 cubits in width, and 30 cubits in height, a vessel so large that it dwarfed any boat that had ever been built before. It was constructed in 3 levels, with rooms and compartments carefully designed to house not just Noah's family but representatives of all the animal life on Earth. The wood was gopher wood, covered inside and out with pitch to make it waterproof, and the construction was so solid that it could withstand forces no ordinary ship would ever face. As Noah continued his work year after year, never wavering in his commitment, the heavens moved in a spectacle of divine forces invisible to mortal eyes but no less real for their invisibility. The archangels, those mighty warriors of heaven who had remained faithful when their brothers fell, received orders from on high, commands that would set in motion the purification of the earth. Their wings stretched toward earth, carrying them on missions of judgment and preparation. Raphael, the celestial warrior whose name meant God heals, was sent to capture Azazel, the leader of the rebellion that had corrupted Earth's creatures and taught humanity the arts of war and destruction. Azazel, once beautiful beyond description, had become the very embodiment of corruption, his form twisted by his own evil into something that retained beauty but was fundamentally wrong, a perversion of what he had been created to be. In the depths of the mountains, in a hidden place where Azazel had established his throne and ruled over a kingdom of darkness, Raphael found him. The confrontation was brief but terrible. Azazel, for all his power and cunning, was no match for an archangel who moved with the full authority of heaven. Raphael, a being of power and purpose, of righteous anger and divine mandate, moved with a speed and certainty that left no room for resistance. With chains of spiritual fire, bonds that could not be broken by any earthly force, he bound Azazel hand and foot, wrapping him in coils of divine judgment that burned without consuming. And then, with a motion that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, Raphael cast him into an abyss of eternal darkness, a pit so deep that no light had ever penetrated it, where he would remain until the end of time, until the final judgment when all accounts would be settled. Meanwhile, Gabriel, the messenger whose name meant strength of God, the angel who had always served as God's primary communicator with humanity, had a different mission. He was sent not to capture but to manipulate, to sow discord among the giants so that destruction would come not only from without but from within their own hearts, so that they would turn upon each other in a frenzy of mutual destruction. Gabriel moved among them invisibly, unseen but not unfelt, his presence like a poison in their minds. He whispered words of distrust into the ears of the giants, suggestions that their brothers were plotting against them, insinuations that they were being cheated of their rightful share of power and plunder. He breathed envy into their hearts, causing them to look at what others possessed with bitter resentment. He planted seeds of hatred that grew quickly in soil already fertile with violence and pride, causing old alliances to fracture and new enmities to spring up overnight. Until the once allied clans, united in their oppression of humanity, began to turn against each other with the same fury they had previously directed only at their victims. The last war of the giants was about to begin, a conflict that would make all their previous wars seem small by comparison. A war without mercy and without victors, where giants would fall by the thousands, slaughtered not by divine intervention but by their own kind. The fields would run red with their blood, and their bodies would lie unburied across the landscape, a testament to the self-destructive nature of evil. They would destroy each other with the same weapons and tactics that Azazel had taught them, their own knowledge becoming the instrument of their downfall. Noah, oblivious to all this celestial activity, unaware of the angelic battles being fought and the divine plans being executed, continued his work diligently day after day, year after year. He knew that the ark was not just a construction project, not merely a large boat built for a practical purpose. It was a promise, a silent promise of survival, a physical manifestation of God's intention to preserve life even in the midst of judgment. A promise that despite the chaos unfolding around them, despite the corruption that seemed to have conquered everything, there was still a chance, still hope for a new beginning. A chance to save what remained of purity, of innocence, of life untainted by the corruption of the giants and the fallen angels. A chance to preserve the animals that had done no wrong, the innocent creatures who had no part in humanity's rebellion. A chance to carry forward into a new world the knowledge of righteousness, the memory of what life was meant to be before the fall of the Watchers had twisted everything. And so as the world around him crumbled, as the giants went to war with each other and humanity huddled in terror watching their oppressors destroy one another, as the fallen angels realized that their doom was sealed and their children were doomed, Noah continued to hammer, one beat at a time, like the sound of the last echo of justice in a lost world. The rhythm of his work was like a heartbeat, steady and constant, a reminder that life continued, that not everything had been consumed by darkness. Then the heavens changed. The clouds grew like black walls, towering one over the other until they hid all light, building upward in impossible formations that defied natural weather patterns. The sun was blotted out, not gradually as in a normal storm, but suddenly and completely, as if a curtain had been drawn across the sky. Darkness fell at midday, a darkness so complete that it seemed less like the absence of light and more like the presence of something actively dark. Lightning split the heavens, not as mere flashes as in an ordinary thunderstorm, but like flaming swords ripping through the firmament, tears in the fabric of reality itself through which divine wrath poured forth. Each flash felt as if the very fabric of creation were being torn asunder, as if the world was being unmade. The lightning was different from natural lightning. It was too bright, too sustained, too purposeful, carrying with it not just light and heat but a sense of judgment and inevitability. A deep sound, almost a groan, echoed from the depths of the world, rising up from places far beneath the surface where humans had never ventured. The earth wept, mourning the corruption that had infected it, crying out as the pollution was about to be purged. The sound grew louder and louder until it became a roar, a deafening sound like 1,000 storms unleashed at once, like the voice of the planet itself screaming in anguish. Then came the water. The fountains of the great deep burst open, cracks appearing in the earth from which geysers of water erupted with impossible force. The womb of the earth spewed forth rivers of fury, water that had been trapped beneath the surface since creation now released in torrents that carved new valleys and reshaped the landscape in minutes. These were not mere springs but massive upwellings of water under tremendous pressure, erupting with such force that they threw water hundreds of feet into the air. Simultaneously, the windows of heaven were thrown open, and from on high descended endless curtains of water, rain like the world had never seen before and would never see again. They were not drops but liquid walls, heavy and solid as a veil of death that stretched over everything, rain so thick that it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction, so heavy that it flattened plants and drove animals into whatever shelter they could find. The water fell not in a normal rain pattern but in sheets, in walls, in masses that seemed to have weight and substance beyond mere liquid. The world, gripped by terror, ran in despair, suddenly understanding that the madman Noah had been right, that the judgment he had warned about for decades was actually happening. Men cried out for salvation, pounding on the door of the ark that God himself had sealed, begging to be let in, promising to change, swearing they would be righteous if only they were given another chance. But the door remained closed, sealed by divine decree, and no human force could open it. The Nephilim, those haughty giants, sons of corruption who had terrorized humanity for generations, rose on the highest mountains, abandoning their cities and fortresses below, certain that their height and strength would save them from mere water. They climbed to the peaks, gathering in groups, mocking the rising waters even as their feet got wet. They were confident that the flood would reach a certain level and stop, that they would survive on the mountaintops and emerge to rule over whatever remained of the world. One of them, perhaps Gilgamesh himself, the greatest of the giants, the one whose deeds had made him legendary even among his own kind, raised his voice against the thunder in a final act of defiance. A roar of fury, a challenge to the Creator, words of blasphemy and rebellion shouted into the storm. He shook his fist at the heavens, cursing God, declaring that no judgment could destroy him, that he would survive and rebuild his kingdom, that the giants would never be defeated. But the sky did not respond with words, only with the thunder of a lightning bolt that split the heavens, a single massive bolt of lightning that struck him directly, illuminating his giant form for a moment before the energy coursed through him. And with the lightning came the waters, which rose relentlessly, crushing everything in their path with patient, inexorable force. The water climbed the mountains faster than the giants could climb, pursuing them, overtaking them, sweeping them away. The mountains, once secure and firm, bastions of strength that had stood since the foundation of the world, became fleeting islands, temporary refuges that offered only brief respite from the rising waters. And even they disappeared beneath the relentless advance of the flood, one by one submerged, their peaks vanishing under the waves until there was no land visible anywhere, nothing but water stretching from horizon to horizon. A colossal vortex swallowed giants whole, whirlpools forming as water rushed into underwater canyons and caves, creating suction that pulled everything nearby into their depths. The giants, for all their size and strength, were as helpless as children in the face of these forces. Their roar, a mixture of despair and defiance, rage and terror, was lost in the foam, drowned out by the sound of the storm and the rushing water. Their voices, united with those of men, formed a single scream, a symphony of terror that rose for a moment above the sound of destruction and then was silenced forever, as one by one they were pulled beneath the surface. Some giants tried to swim, their powerful limbs thrashing in the water, but even the strongest swimmer cannot swim forever, and there was nowhere to swim to, no shore to reach, no island to provide rest. They swam until exhaustion overcame them, until their muscles gave out, until they could no longer keep their heads above water, and then they sank into the depths, their bodies joining those of the humans and animals that had already perished. Others tried to build rafts or float on debris, clinging to trees that had been uprooted or pieces of buildings that had been torn apart by the flood. But the violence of the waters, the waves that rose like mountains, the winds that howled with hurricane force, destroyed whatever they tried to use for flotation. They were swept from their makeshift vessels and disappeared beneath the waves, their final moments filled with the bitter knowledge that all their power had meant nothing in the end. For 40 days and 40 nights, the world was undone, systematically dismantled by forces that made human power seem laughable by comparison. The forests were uprooted, ancient trees that had stood for thousands of years torn from the ground and carried away like matchsticks. The temples and palaces of kings were swept away like grains of sand, their massive stones scattered across the earth or buried under layers of sediment. Cities that had taken generations to build were destroyed in hours, their walls collapsed, their buildings crushed, their treasures scattered across the ocean floor. No flesh survived, no human voice remained outside the ark. Every person who had mocked Noah, every giant who had tyrannized humanity, every follower of the fallen angels, every practitioner of their forbidden arts, all were swept away. Creation was purified by the tears of divine judgment, cleansed by water that washed away not just physical bodies but the very memory of the corruption that had infected the world. The earth itself was being renewed, prepared for a fresh start. And when the roar ceased, when the rain finally stopped falling and the fountains of the deep were closed, when the violence of the storm gave way to eerie calm, there was only the sound of the waters covering everything from the deepest valley to the highest mountain. The world had been transformed into a single ocean, with no land visible anywhere, water stretching unbroken in every direction as far as the eye could see. And there, in the middle of an endless, horizonless ocean, floating on waters that covered the peaks of the tallest mountains, a single wooden boat floated. Small when compared to the vastness of the ocean, solitary in a world that had been emptied of all other human presence, but holding within it the promise of life, the seeds of a new beginning, the hope that all was not lost. The ark rode the waves peacefully, supernaturally stable despite the massive size of the swells, protected by the same divine power that had commanded its construction. Inside, Noah and his family lived in close quarters with the animals they had been commanded to preserve. They fed them, cared for them, kept them calm despite the sound of the storm raging outside. They trusted that God who had brought them into the ark would bring them safely out again, that the waters that destroyed would eventually recede, that land would appear again and life could begin anew. The end had arrived, the end of the age of giants, the end of the age of corruption, the end of the first world. But as is always true with God, every ending is also a beginning, every judgment is also an act of mercy, every destruction is also preparation for new creation. The waters, which for so long had covered the earth like a veil of judgment, a shroud over the dead world, began to recede. The process was gradual but steady, the water level dropping day by day as the fountains of the deep were sealed and the rain stopped and God sent a wind over the earth to begin drying it. The roar of the abysses ceased, replaced by the quieter sound of draining water and receding waves. The sea that had swallowed cities and mountains, that had covered every inch of dry land, now little by little revealed the ground again. First the peaks of the highest mountains emerged, breaking the surface of the water like islands rising from the ocean. Then the upper slopes became visible, showing the scars left by the flood. Trees stripped of their bark, soil scoured away, rocks tumbled and rearranged. Gradually more and more land appeared as the water continued to drain away, flowing into the new ocean basins, settling into the new geography that the flood had created. And the ark, that immense work made by the hands of an obedient man, that vessel of salvation that had seemed so foolish to those who watched it being built, that boat that had preserved life through the judgment, rested gently on the mountains of Ararat. It settled onto a high peak as the waters receded around it, coming to rest in a place far from where it had been built, carried by the flood to a new land where a new beginning could occur. The silence that followed the cessation of the storm was profound, almost sacred, very different from the terrifying silence that had preceded the flood. It was as if all creation, renewed and purified, washed clean of the corruption that had infected it, awaited the next act in the divine drama. The air was still, the only sound the gentle lapping of receding waters against the slopes of the mountain. Birds began to sing again, their voices tentative at first but growing in confidence, celebrating their survival.